everybody, it's Chris from Guilty Words, where we unravel crime one word at a time. Or tonight, we're going to unravel it one number at a time. When I was looking through all of Sarah's records in order to see the types of things she and her lawyers had written, I also came across all the motions for cost that the various lawyers had put before the court to get experts approved and private investigators approved and travel expenses approved. And I was clicking on them because I was just very curious what experts they were calling and how much experts really went for. As I went through it, though, I became even more intrigued by the types of experts they were asking for and the types of costs they were asking to be reimbursed for. It seemed like a little glimpse into the minds of the lawyers and how they were intending to defend Sarah. And at the end, Sarah's latest request for her own expert gives us a little hint what she might do as well. At the end, I'll have a total of the amount that JAC approved for these experts, with a few caveats about how I came to that number, so stay with us for that. But in the meantime, let's do guilty numbers, see what we can find out and what we can glean from what the lawyers were asking for. Let's take a look at it together. Before we begin, there are just a couple points I wanted to cover. The first is I want this to be a no judgment zone. I looked at these numbers out of pure curiosity. My point is not to bring up discussion about whether or not a certain expertise is worth the amount of money they're choosing. The other thing was, I'm only including cost motions that were granted by the JAC. There were a few that lawyers asked for that the JAC said no. And there were a couple that I couldn't quite figure out if they said yes or no, and we'll talk about those as we get to them. And then the total at the end doesn't include extra or hidden costs. There were things like a motion would be granted, but it had a caveat that extra things like travel would be extra. But it is an eye-opening look at what goes into a defense. Mr. Padilla, the first lawyer who started requesting things, was by far the one who requested the most experts. And that's maybe because other lawyers were able to rely on what he discovered. He started off first with a crime scene or forensic expert, and he asked for $7,500 at $150 an hour. And then there was an understanding about extra for travel time. He asked for an electronic evidence expert at $20,000 at $200 an hour, plus again the extra for reimbursement for travel. A forensic psychologist at $7,500, $200 an hour. Private investigator, Prison Break came on right at the start, although it wasn't Billy Lane, it was someone else. By February of 2021, he needed more from the crime scene and forensic expert, so they asked for additional funds. So apparently that person was doing quite a bit of work. He himself was traveling. A year into the case, asked for a forensic pathologist for $7,500 at $300 an hour. Looking at this, he obviously was going to be questioning the crime scene investigation, all the electronics from her phone and wherever else, Sarah's own mental state, and maybe even the autopsy results. Additional funds were requested for Prison Break. Prison Break actually had a reimbursement for travel expenses to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Worcester, Mass., and Clinton, Mass., and the report said to investigate and interview witnesses. I am really curious, who was it they were talking to up in my end of the world? Expense was in November for discovery production. Apparently they had been given a USB drive and they needed to make hard copies of everything on that USB drive for discovery, and it cost almost $4,000. This intrigues me because we just had Prison Break take all the paper copies and put them back onto 3 USB drives that Sarah hated. So I don't know where this original USB drive was, or maybe not everything was included. I just think it's intriguing how things go from USB to paper and back to USB and back to paper. And Mr. Padilla traveled some more. And then in February, remember he's already asked for a forensic psychologist. He asked for a domestic violence psychology expert. So you can see he was leaning towards a domestic violence abuse defense, or at least it looks like it to me. I'm not a lawyer, so let me know what you think. What intrigued me about this one actually was the notes and how precise they were in the payment that this person was supposed to get. $350 for the initial exam, and then $170 for the first hour of court testimony, $85 an hour if they're just waiting to testify, $72.50 if they're waiting to testify at a deposition. I would think waiting would be waiting, but $75 an hour for travel time, and then $160 for things they were doing out of court, writing reports or whatever. That was the only one that was that specifically broken down. The crime scene forensic expert is back again for an additional 50 hours and an extra $1,000 for lodging. They were doing a lot with whatever they wanted to question on the crime scene and the forensics. Mr. Padilla traveled some more. He ordered some transcripts, not surprising considering he had dozens of depositions in this time. Hard at work, doing all this travel, all this time. The state has already said that they are ready for trial, and he withdraws in April of 2022 because of adversarial and irreconcilable differences with Sarah. All right, Mr. Bankowitz comes on board. He already has the advantage of everything that Mr. Padilla has done with the other experts. He asks for a private investigator and wants it switched from Prison Break to a company called Aaron & Associates, and he asks for $10,000. I put an asterisk by this because I can't see where JAC approved this. Same thing with a mitigation expert to assist him. He asked for basically a legal assistant to help him with Sarah's case. I see what was asked for, I just don't see where it was approved. And he wanted an additional mental health expert. He was asking for $15,000, $400 an hour, $125 an hour for travel. JAC responded to him, they didn't approve it, they asked him to justify it. They said that was outside the scope of what they usually paid for hourly rates. Before he got into the justification for any of that, he withdrew in September of 23. Then Mr. Hobson comes on. He also asked for money for a private investigator and asked the court to switch the record back to Prison Break. Prison Break came back on with an additional $7,500. He also asked for a forensic mental health expert. Now, what was interesting about this motion was there were no prices attached, but he had a particular person in line that he was vetting, and he said that she was an expert in battered women syndrome, domestic violence, personality disorders, battering husbands, infidelity, alcohol abuse, blackouts, and inter alia. I'm not sure I'm saying that right. And I didn't know what that meant, so I got to learn a new word. It's Latin for among other things. So thank you, Mr. Hobson. I was not aware of inter alia, but maybe I'll try and use it. Before he could get approval or for the mental health expert or have further discussion about it, he withdrew in February of 2024. Again, because of whatever was going on with Sarah, Miss Cashman comes on board. She asks for transcription. She also asks for a mental health expert, $200 an hour for 15 hours, and this becomes important later, so pay attention to that. That was approved by JAC. And more transcription. Before anything more can be done, she withdraws in June 2024. Sarah becomes pro se. When she becomes pro se, the court itself approves an additional $11,000 for Prison Break investigations. It's $10,000 for Prison Break and $1,000 for expenses. And when I saw this addition and realized it came on top of money already paid, and it was double what the average lawyer had been asking for, I finally realized what they were doing. They knew she was going to have difficulty with things like internet and phone calls and everything else, and that's why they approved so much extra for Billy Lane and his company, was in order to be Sarah's right hand. So they weren't just leaving her out in the cold. Now Sarah, on August 14th, a couple of weeks ago, put in a motion for cost requesting a neuropsychologist specifically. She wanted $15,000 $300 an hour, travel at $125 an hour, and the JAC answered that they had already approved $3,000 for attorney Cashman that hadn't been used, so basically start with that. Or give us more justification why you need this particular neuropsychologist. It's interesting to trace the mental health experts who have been in this, because with attorney Bankowitz, there is a sealed 50-something page motion that has to do with mental health. And obviously I don't know what's in there, but I wish I did. And the latest, the fees for each of the attorneys who have withdrawn. Fascinating to see a lot of investigation going on. It seems like Mr. Padilla was doing a lot with the crime scene investigation, and a lot seems to hinge on mental health experts. Now keep in mind, none of these costs reflect what the state is paying for probably very similar things. So what's the grand total? Well, I didn't count Mr. Bankowitz's 3 that I couldn't confirm were approved, so that $35,000 is not included in the total. But if I do a loose adding up of the amount column, it comes to $158,000 and counting. And I put that in counting in there because if you remember when Sarah wrote a letter to Mr. Bankowitz, she's like, "You've been my lawyer for 3,400 whatever hours and counting." So now this $158,000 is just the motions for costs for the expert and the private investigators. I'm sure there's much more in terms of travel or other expenses that isn't in here. I don't know how it works with what you have to ask for and what you don't. One thing to remind people that wasn't in there was a $15,000 check for Mr. Padilla, since he was pro bono. Is it a lot of money? Yes. It's actually a little bit less than I expected for the length of time this has been going on, but it's not over yet. So what conclusions can we draw from all this? Well, it was not a good choice on Sarah's part to get rid of these lawyers, especially Mr. Padilla, who seemed to really have an end goal in mind for what he was going to do when he got to trial, despite everything Sarah said later about him being disorganized, unprofessional, inexperienced, and everything else. It does seem like the defense at that time with the lawyers, they were looking at some kind of mental health defense, and it seems like she may be trying to go down that road herself. Let me know in the comments if you know who Prison Break might have been interviewing in the Northeast. I'm just very curious about that as well. And at this point, we have just a little bit of time till the trial and all the questions will be answered, I guess. If you want a quick little tour of who was deposed, by all means let me know and I'll throw that up here for you too. I know this isn't the usual guilty words examination of the client's words, but I thought, well, I was fascinated by this, so maybe you would be too. Let me know in the comments what you'd like to see. And as always, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate you spending time here. And if you've enjoyed this content, I would be honored to have your subscription. Please give it a thumbs up so it can get out to other people. And until I see you in the next video, please use your words wisely and well. Take care.